Hey guys, so we're working our way through the Sermon on the Mount, and one of the things we're going to take a look at today is Jesus teaching about personal relationships. And so Jesus is going to be unpacking some of the Ten Commandments, and maybe just to start us off here, we'll see that just a paraphrase, but Jesus says, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, everyone who is angry will be liable to judgment." Then Jesus goes on to say, if you're offering your gift at the altar, there remember that your brother has something against you. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. And so what Jesus is really doing is, if we think about murder, we have to really go back and think about the first murder. And what happened in that very first murder was that one brother began to have envy and bitterness towards another brother. And this divide began to develop in this brother's heart and in this brother's life. And he never began to really reconcile what was going on inside of his heart. You can see my fun little drawing here. But one of the things that Jesus wants to point to is say that, when you're angry or when you lash out or when you begin to harbor feelings in your own heart towards another person, you're bitter towards them. That same spirit that was here in Cain is beginning to also fester in you. And so you could wind up being guilty of the same thing, and maybe you won't murder. Maybe because of your fear of the consequences, or your desire to have social approval so people don't think you're a bad person, or for a variety of reasons, those inhibitors may cause you not to commit murder. But you still have those same early feelings that Cain had in his heart. And those things can begin to dominate and wield you and wield your soul in a way that begins to corrupt you and change you into a kind of person that isn't the kind of person that God wants you to be. So God gives us his law. And Moses goes up to the mountain, he brings down the commands of God. And one of those commands is, you shall not murder. I want the kind of relationships that you have in this world not to be one where you're harming and killing one another, but where they're whole and where they're good. But the problem with this is that people get this law, and Jesus is creating this new society of people who are not going to live like this, but they keep living like that, and there's still brokenness. And we get to the time of the prophets where Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they talk about, we don't love God, we don't love his law. And there's something broken inside of us so that we don't even desire to do those kinds of good things. But a time is coming when God is going to write those laws on the hearts of his people. And then we have one day a man, Jesus, shows up. And he goes up a mountain, a hillside. And he begins to quote and talk about those laws. And he really begins to get underneath and interpret and tell us what it means, what God really intended. That it wasn't just about murder, but it was about anger, and it was about dissension and strife and envy and all of these things that got birthed in the very beginning that caused the problems in our world. That we participate in this kind of society when we fail to obey God's commands and do what he really wanted us to do out of our heart. And so what moves us from this place where we're not loving God and we're not following his law to where we are going to do that? And that came not just through Jesus doing anything different than what Moses did, teaching these laws, but in something else that Jesus did. And that is that one day, if you can see on the camera here, Jesus came and he went up another hill. And on that hill, on that cross, he bore our sin, our failure. So in those moments when we feel that bondage of anger and discontentment, those feelings that are playing out in our head of bitterness towards another person, the rage maybe that is building, or maybe just, like I said, bitterness and unforgiveness is harboring and creating that dissension and this world that we're participating in. That when we begin to say, I don't want to live this way anymore, and you begin to realize that Jesus says, that's why I died. Because you brought some of this into the world just like he did. Then you and all of us are guilty like this. What hope is there for us? And Christ says, on the cross, I bore it. And when you realize that, you come to God so thankful for the forgiveness and grace that you don't deserve, that he gives to you. And guess what happens? Through the cross, through that failure, through that, God begins to write the law on our hearts. And we come to him and we say, then I owe you everything. He says, you do. And then we begin to love him and live out the things that he called us to live from the heart. And it's written on us. So that through the cross, we begin to realize the power that God unleashed in this world, so that we may break down the rift and that a new society of people would be born who live out the values of the kingdom. And Jesus is teaching us week by week now as he walks through his Sermon on the Mount of what it means to live out those values. And part of it here is fixing the broken relationships of our world.